Hello, and welcome to the Decent Ideas podcast, where decent needn't necessarily mean polite in an indecent time, nor should it mean perfect for obvious reasons. What it must mean is fitting and suitable to that time. I'm Terence. So, we've discussed kind of at length at this point in previous episodes the riots on Capitol Hill on January 6th in the context of a number of issues, and we've at least alluded to, I think, the issue of white supremacy and white nationalism as it relates to this issue, and that's worth continuing, I think, to revisit. But for the time being, in the midst of some current events that make us think anew about race and ethnicity issues, and issues of discrimination in the US, I wanted to get into that a little bit and see if we can maybe pull apart the problem a little bit and think through some ways that it might go about being resolved. So the two issues in particular that I wanted to get at are the recent spate in anti-Asian violence, exemplified most recently by the shooting in Atlanta of 8 people, including 6 Asian women, primarily Korean, I believe, Korean American women. And I also wanted to discuss the kind of tenuous situation at the border and both kind of the fear mongering around it and also the real issues involved. And the idea here is to get at kind of the state of civil and political rights as they relate to these issues. So, by way of background, we obviously have a history as long as the age of our country, if you will, in racial violence, in racial discrimination, both kind of directly as it relates to white supremacy and sort of more, I guess, indirectly. So, recently, there's been discussion on the part of conspiracy theorists who have somehow made their way into Congress, like Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia, about the degree to which Jewish people have been involved in and, conspiring behind the scenes of protests like those in Charlottesville and those the riots on Capitol Hill on the 6th. So history of Jewish violence and Jewish discrimination exemplified. We also, of course, have the fresh in our memory, hopefully, Black Lives Matter protests related to George Floyd's death and, of course, a subsequent number of other terrible acts of violence against unarmed Black people by police, as well as the sort of backlash to that in the sense that our country is experiencing unrest that needs to be quelled and goes obviously to a number of racial stereotypes about African American people. Obviously, we have a history, a fairly recent history, I should say, of scapegoating Middle Easterners, Arabs, Iranians for Islamic terrorism, and a degree to which we perhaps center that issue when it shouldn't necessarily be centered. In addition, we have the appropriation, stereotyping, and fetishization of Native Americans that's been around for a good long time, but has been sort of exemplified around the debate about the future of sports teams that have racially insensitive names based in stereotypes of Native American culture. And obviously, on top of all this, discrimination on the basis of biological sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation is still as rampant a problem as ever. So I bring those up as kind of a way of addressing that there's a sort of cyclical nature to the way we respond to racial problems, problems of racism, and we have an unfortunate tendency to kind of cycle through, I would hazard to say, the different groups that we can scapegoat. And so I think that bears kind of keeping in mind when we talk about this sort of recent racially divisive violence and scapegoating that we're seeing now with what's going on at the border and what's going on in these attacks against Asian Americans. So Just a little bit of background to the what's going on at the border. So the problem at the border appears at least to be a backlash to Trump's kind of severe policies towards the end of his administration, especially with people being forced to quote, remain in Mexico, coming back and trying again, basically a recidivism problem, if you will, of people at the border being turned away and then just coming right back. And sort of compounding this problem is United States Code Title 42, Section 265, which allows for the rejection of immigrants from countries where a communicable disease is present, which I would argue is perhaps the most stringent policy the Biden administration has continued applying as a carryover from the Trump administration. So, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic being the trigger for this, that appears to be aggravating the crisis at the border. And I should also note that it's not being applied universally because millions of people are still crossing the border. So the notion that, we've locked down the border appears to be at best, a false one. If not an intentionally, shall we say, aggrandized problem. So on top of that, the Biden administration is either breaking the law or at least allowing the law to be broken by not assuring children are processed and sent from Customs and Border Protection to Health and Human Services shelters within 72 hours. So right now the average is somewhere closer to 5 days instead of 72 hours, with several hundreds being held 10 days or more. In addition, the Mexican government has announced that it would stop accepting non-Mexican family units with minor children, so they'd only be accepting single adults that are returned to Mexico under Title 42, which sounds like, and I think the reporting needs to do some catching up, but it sounds like it leaves them in kind of no man's land between the US and Mexico, which is not a great place to be. And you combine this with the Biden administration's choice to allow unaccompanied children to stay, which makes for a complicated problem again of people being housed, of children being housed in these detention facilities that are suboptimal at best, shall we say, and unsustainable. And sort of, I guess, complicating that problem one step further is the sort of, I guess, sporadic and inconsistent reporting around human trafficking and drug trafficking at the border, where it's not clear exactly how pervasive that issue is, and it's often very politicized by one side or the other. So that's the kind of landscape for the problem at the border and where we stand on that. So if we move on to the anti-Asian violence problem, which again was kind of highlighted by this Atlanta shooting. 6 of the 8 victims of the shooting, 6 of the 8 deaths were Asian women. Like I said, East Asian women, I believe particularly Korean American women. And obviously the sort of first reaction is, oh, okay, this is racially motivated and particularly motivated by the kind of backlash to Asian immigrants over, what Trump has called the China virus, right? The COVID pandemic. But upon, further scrutiny, it's not quite so simple, right? So we have this concept, well, let's just call it what it is, a discriminatory concept that has a part in our cultural history in this country of East Asians and South Asians to a certain extent being, quote, a model minority, which is to say, these are groups that at least cursorily speaking do a better job of assimilating economically to our culture and to, finding a way of life. And this stereotype is obviously very damaging because it, obviously like any immigrant population, it's a diverse group in any number of ways, including socioeconomic class. And so, the question here is to what extent the discrimination involved is, related to this model minority concept. And I'll come back to that shortly. In addition, the places that were targeted on this attack by this singular lone wolf white man is that he targeted spas. And of course, there's the unfortunate very unfortunate, I should say, stereotype about sex work in spas and certain perceptions around that. And I guess more generally, there is a concept of fetishization of Asian women in U.S. culture, which is, again, not to be redundant, but very unfortunate. And so when you bring these all together, you start to get a picture of kind of what unfolded here. The shooter targeted these spas and appears to have ascribed to an extreme Christianist, if you will, interpretation about sexual behavior, and has been previously treated for sex addiction. And actually, Zed Jelani is an independent journalist, had a interesting piece in Newsweek where he endeavored to kind of add some color to the anti-Asian violence debate and talked about like how this particular attack was motivated by, as he calls it, a perverse sexual temptation that he wanted to eliminate, and that this was how he did that, by shooting up these spas. And he also kind of goes into a discussion, like I mentioned before, of the model minority, and by extension of that, the sort of minority on minority violence that can derive from that, where if the perception is that Asian Americans do better at assimilating economically, then perhaps they're better targets for violence or for robbery in particular, because it's perceived that more can be gained from robbing them. And so, like I say, it leads to this sort of very complicated picture. And I'll admit, first of all, I respect Zed Jelani as a journalist greatly, but I would say that there's a degree to which he takes sometimes a kind of contrarian view, and it's not necessarily a bad thing all the time, but I'd argue in this case he sort of bends over backwards to make the case that this isn't a racially motivated thing, that okay, maybe it's a sexually motivated thing, maybe it's a particular just problem of this particular individual who carried out the shooting. But I would argue probably that this is more an example where the exception proves the rule, if you will, in that it doesn't have to be solely racially motivated or solely sexually motivated or what have you for it to be an indicator of both problems. And while it might not be directly related to the kind of China virus trope by Trump, it does at least draw attention to it, which is always a good thing, to draw attention to these problems in our society that are likely not going away. And many sort of Asian American leaders have drawn the relationship to the BLM protests and kind of the fight against white supremacy. And while we should always endeavor to be nuanced in our views on these particular issues, I think it's fair to draw allusions between movements for racial justice where we can, in order to bring them forward. And so that's where I kind of differentiate myself from Mr. Jelani's perspective. But nevertheless, I will say again, I do generally respect him very much as a journalist. And so with that, I'd like to talk just briefly about kind of the current state of legal protections for minorities and immigrants in our country. And they're based, kind of primarily around due process and equal protection clauses that sort of run through amendments to the Constitution and are therefore, constitutionally protected. Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, 14th Amendment. These all kind of get to the degree to which people should have equal protection under the law and be entitled to due process in the event of some wrongdoing, which is, good that we have it, arguably not evenly applied. And so I'll come back to that. But I guess sort of the other major legal protection that we see is with regard to the right to vote, which theoretically means that minorities have the opportunity in this country to vote people in that will uphold those rights and perhaps expand those rights, but also the legal protections for them, but also vote out, those that demonstrate that they aren't as willing perhaps to protect those rights. And so those are constitutionally protected under amendments like the 15th Amendment, the 19th, and the 24th Amendment. And so it comes to, a point of, it gets to a place, I think, that it's unclear how we should proceed in terms of how to better protect these classes of people, racial or ethnic in this case in particular. And so I usually like to come to kind of the state of hate speech. In the US, we have a sort of, in terms of international law, kind of notorious kind of lack of protection against hate speech. In fact, we only have one or perhaps two kind of recent cases where we made an effort to combat hate speech, albeit quite indirectly. And that was in the Supreme Court case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, which basically ruled that inflammatory speech can be punished if it is, quote, directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. And that case was kind of bolstered by another case, which was Hess versus Indiana in 1973, which basically said if it's at some indefinite future time, then it doesn't count as a direct, imminent lawless action incitement, but sort of, further delineated the lines of, if it is towards imminent lawless action, then that is not protected speech. And so I guess sort of, to zoom out for a little bit, generally speaking, we have, kind of a state right now where we make legal immigration from Latin America, frankly, prohibitively difficult by drastically limiting and increasing the qualifications for a pathway to citizenship. And then, immigrants and people of color are just generally too easily deemed to be, or allowed to be deemed to be, other. And it's natural to try to identify a safe in-group. It's very human. It's kind of built into our DNA in terms of safety, like a desire for safety and security, but it's vastly overapplied and it's reinforced by our system. And sort of similarly, fetishization of other races is an outgrowth of this principle of, the in-group versus the out-group. Making someone different into something exotic and or dangerous is, again, it's a problem of over-application of a biological principle that's kind of reinforced and ingrained and institutionalized in our system. And then if you combine that with misogyny and toxic masculinity, which appears to be the case in this shooting in Atlanta, it's a dangerous recipe. So I guess where we get to kind of the decent ideas of the day, if you will, I think there are many things that we can be doing that would basically put people on a more level playing field. And some of these are, fairly clear, right? And perhaps less original, if you will, for this podcast, but still, relevant and important to discussion. Absolutely, which is, that we should be looking to improve the rights of participation in civil society and politics and, protect those with the law. We have a degree to which, I think, as I alluded to before, we limit the votes of minorities by preventing early voting, purging voter rolls, having voter ID laws, and allowing the reduction in the amount of polling places. And then also we can look to expanding rights of procedural fairness in the law. So obviously we have a problem of mass incarceration that predominantly falls on minorities, and that goes to drug cases and excessive bail in the case where if you're dealing with a racial minority effectively, in a lot of cases because of the institutionalized racism, we're talking about an issue where any bail is too much bail, or very little bail is too much bail because of those socioeconomic differences. And obviously we can also look to improving rights against discrimination on the basis of being a protected class, right? So race, sex, religion, etc. We need to look to expanding voting rights, housing rights, education rights, and more. So kind of two examples of this that are extant in our political discourse are the Voting Rights Act, which was sort of curbed by a Supreme Court case called Shelby County versus Holder, which basically, as I alluded to just now, allows sort of increased pre-clearance, increased sort of ways to screen voters and prevent disproportionately people of color from voting. So the Voting Rights Act, I believe it's the latest iteration is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, named after the late, great civil rights activist and Representative John Lewis. And then also we have the Equality Act, which expands discrimination, prohibition in employment, housing, public accommodations, education, credit, and so on. So we can work to, put people on a level playing field under the law. We can also work to put people on a level playing field economically. And obviously two very controversial, I suppose, for lack of better terminology, kinds of programs, which would be programs for reparations for minority groups and the broadening of universal public programs, which I discussed recently in the episode about creating a more human-centered economy. And then that leads to kind of the next sort of way to kind of put people on a level playing field. And I've alluded to this as well, which is getting at kind of defamatory and or hate speech and just dehumanizing speech. So obviously we have this Brandenburg versus Ohio case bolstered by the Hess versus Indiana case that basically says if it's not imminent lawless behavior that's being incited, then it doesn't count as speech that can be abridged effectively. So I guess what I'd bring to the fore would be, what about, a pattern of conduct or a pattern of behavior inciting lawless action against a protected class or group, whether or not it's at some indefinite future time, as Hess versus Indiana ruled. To get more at, again, this is about leveling the playing field. If we can get to a place where we're making it harder to discriminate in terms of speech, and free speech, like any right that we have, comes with, and this is borne out by the founders, it comes with an assumed degree of limits on that right and protections against abuse of that right or those rights. So I think expanding hate speech laws is well within the realm of discussion here for how we address problems of racism in the country. And I guess lastly, what I'd get into is, how do we build from kind of this civil rights system and making it less bigoted, if you will, less prejudiced against certain classes of people, that we move from there onto anti-exploitation in how we approach our civil rights and political rights system. And so two recent examples, again, sort of more mainstream in the sense that these have been introduced in Congress, are the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, also known as the PRO Act, which increases employees' rights to organize and to collectively bargain, and especially in, industries that are more populated, if you will, in the leagues of the workers by racial and ethnic minorities, having the ability to organize more effectively and with less barriers, less legal barriers, you can achieve greater rights for these individuals, and that's necessary for getting past these kinds of racial issues. And perhaps less well known, most prominent of them being the Violence Against Women Act, are kind of bills that are at various stages of passage in state and federal law to increase the rights of victims who are too easily silenced or intimidated. And this goes, particularly in the case of the Violence Against Women Act, it's been sort of lauded, and I think absolutely reasonably so, in that it protects Native American women. And there are also, kind of bills that are more directed at victims' rights in general. There's something called the Victims' Rights Amendment, which has been implemented in a number of states, but has not been federally. And Marsy's Law is similarly in that realm. So I'd encourage people to take a look at that. And so I guess, kind of in general, I give one sort of little hot take, if you will, which is I truly do believe that there should be more collaboration between victims' rights and civil rights groups on getting ahead of crimes that may be committed and protecting the rights of those who have been victimized, which is, I think, that problem, if you will, or confluence of problems, creates a unique opportunity for survivors of violence of all kinds to build solidarity and power together. And, the thing about racism in general is that, obviously this is a problem that is very partisan in its stratification, right? That the sort of party duopoly, if you will, bounces back and forth between the degree to which racism is a problem in this country. And I think, frankly, the data speaks for itself, but the more that people are exposed to these problems, and especially when they touch on individual lives, I think you see politicians from all sides of the aisle kind of start to coalesce when those issues affect them and their families more directly, or those in their immediate network. And so I think we have at least some opportunity when things like this arise, when the view of immigrants becomes an issue again. People have a heart for unaccompanied children, and there's an opportunity to broaden that discussion. And people have a heart for violence against women. I think the fact that the Violence Against Women Act has passed the House again is a good sign. Unfortunately, it may not get much further than that with a very sort of partisanly divided Senate. But these issues do tend to come around perennially. The idealist in me, as I often allude to in this podcast, sees these problems as opportunities, and I hope you do too. And so I think I'll leave it at there for this episode. And obviously, I believe there will and hope there will be ample opportunity to revisit parts of this problem as we go on with this podcast. And I thank you so much for joining me as always. So, as I like to say, I'm available on Twitter at DecentFedPROJ for the Decent Federalism Project. And depending on how you're taking this in, you should know that the podcast is available on both YouTube and most audio podcast platforms. So to that end, next time we'll discuss a new and hopefully timely issue that deserves a new set of eyes. I'm leaning towards foreign policy for this one, but we'll see. Until then, be decent to one another. I hope you fare well, and thanks for listening.